Okay, this tutorial is to make a sample looper with a range control using Buffer and Groove, the normal sample playback systems. I'm using Groove because it has sample loop points, start and end points. And what we're going to use is this thing, which is called the range slider or the R slider. You can get it if you press N for new object and then start typing R slider. You see there. It's a great object, very simple. It gives you this kind of stretchable control. Its output is 0 to 127, same as typical MIDI stuff. And then we're going to use that to set the start point and the end point of the sample. So I want to give you a little demo first to show how it works. We load the sample into the buffer, and I've got a drag and drop object here. It's called drop file, and again new, and if you start typing drop, you'll see it, drop file. That's a really useful way to load samples in. It's got a message box which just adds the word replace in front of whatever the file name is, because the drop file outputs the file name, and that loads it into the buffer. It's a nice, quick and easy way. So as an example, let's lock the patch and drag in a sample. So as you can see, it's a really nice way of interacting with the sample. Of course, you can set sample start and end points by just putting numbers in there. But one of the problems is, depending on the length of sample that you load, of course, the start and end points are going to be different. So how do we make this loop length always the beginning and the end of the sample, no matter what length sample we load? For instance, I think these are all kind of around 30 seconds. Let's just drag and drop another one. It's still going to load. So we still get the whole length of the sample. How do we do that? Well, Buffer, as soon as it loads its sample, Buffer has this little output. All that comes out of there is a bang. So, and it says, if you see my pop up there, it says bang when file read operation completed. So as soon as the file is loaded in, it's going to send a bang. That bang goes into this info, and what the info tilde object does is it gives us info or information about whatever buffer you've selected. So I've put my buffer, and you can see the buffer is called my buffer, and as soon as it receives a bang, it will output information about whatever is in that buffer. So the information that we can get is sample rate, what's this? Sample instrument info, sustain loop start, if there's loop points embedded in the sample, loop end, release, if there's a loop release in there, loop release end, total time. Now that's the one that we're going to use. What else have we got? most recent file name, number of channels. Cool. So there's a few things that you could use, but as I say, the one that we're going to use is total time. That's really useful. That gives us the total time of the sample that we've just loaded into buffer in milliseconds. So how do we use that to reshape the length of this? Well, I'm using a send object. So send, or S for short, length, and I'm receiving the length here. And that is being multiplied by this amount. Now, of course, this slider, as I mentioned, goes from 0 to 127. So what we do first is we divide those numbers by 127, which will give us an output range. If I just put a float in there and just go, if I look at the output first without going through the divider, lock it and just do that. So it goes, let's do it from this side, from 127 down to 0. Now if we divide it by 127, simple maths shows us that that gives us a value range of 1, if I get it right on the edge, yeah, 1 down to 0. Why do we do that? Well, that's the 0 to 1 range is really useful, because when we send it through a multiplier, and if we multiply that by the actual sample length, it will allow us to scan from the end of the sample, which is 27,141, doesn't quite fit on the number box there, all the way down to 0. And of course it doesn't matter what sample you load in, it's always going to update as soon as it's loaded. Poink, outputs the sample length, and then we divide that by 0 to 1, and it will always give us, the loop length will always give us the range of the full sample. It's a really useful little tool. So that, then finally I'm just putting it into these numbers so we can see that's the loop start in milliseconds and the loop end in milliseconds. And they just plug directly into loop min and loop max of the buffer. So how could we develop this? It's working quite nicely. I like the way that you can change the pitch. The looping is turned on automatically. We don't have to turn on loop. I've just used an attribute there. So how can we develop it? Let's close it and open version 2. What I've got here is I've overlaid the R slider on top of the waveform, because in the previous one the R slider was just on its own and it didn't really make any sort of graphical sense. So with it overlaid, and what I had to go into the inspector, and in the background color I chose opacity 0%, so it's completely transparent. And I changed it to green to make it sort of look a bit like an LCD. So that's just overlaid on top of the waveform display. And now if we load in a sample, just grab one of these, drag and drop. They're pretty quiet, aren't they, the samples? Let's see if there's a louder one. Well, they're all quite quiet. We can now see there's parts of it, and we can just select little bits of the sample, and suddenly the R slider makes more sense because we're dragging over portions of a waveform. That's how we're used to working in a DAW. So let's have a listen. Let's turn it on. Cool, so it's working the same, it's just a nicer graphical interface. The other nice thing would be if we had some kind of user interface for the controls that we're playing around with, because it might be nice to assign these controls to loop start and end points. So what I've done is just put in some live dials and tailored them for each thing that they're plugged into. So in the speed, rather than just a number box, I've put in a dial, and I've just, did I use a prototype? I can't remember. I don't think I did. I think I changed its interface with the inspector. So I named it speed. It's just down there in the short name. Its range, I did -10 and a decimal point to +10 and a decimal point. So that's its range. And is there any other things that we had to change in there? Enabled. Oh yeah, I did the display triangle as well, because that gives us a kind of makes it look like a pan control in Ableton. Gives us a midpoint of 0. So we can play around with that. Now, before it was clicking through the speeds in quite a digital way. So I've used the line to create a ramp. It's a 300 millisecond ramp, so that the speed is a bit smoother. If I give you an example of that. So it kind of feels more like a record player. I think it sounds cooler. These line drivers, you can use it on anything that has a value, and it just gives you a smooth line, a smooth ramp. The loop start, they are just going into the R slider, and because the R slider does values of 0 to 127, we can just plug in a normal basic Ableton control, because that works fine. So you've got controls over the start and end points. Get some quite nice clicks as you move it through. Great, so that was a bit more of building the graphical user interface so we can make it playable, because of course once it's these dials, the live dials, you can then easily map a MIDI controller to it. So we're gradually building our little patch. I'm skipping over a lot of things, but hopefully you'll be able to do a bit more investigation into this. A lot of this stuff we've already covered, so hopefully it's a refresher there. Let's close this and move on to number 3. And what I thought it would be good is that with the previous one, I was having to change the start and the end of the loop points independently. What I really wanted to do was have a loop start and a loop length, and then I can, if I give you an example, let's load sound in. If we have a loop length of that, and then change the loop start, now I can, as you can see, I can scan through the sample. It's a slightly different take on it, but that was after playing with it, and the idea of building your prototypes is for you to get something working, play with it, and then that generates more ideas, and you fine-tune your project. So the loop start and loop end controls weren't working for me because I was having to constantly fiddle with both. Having a loop start and a loop length still gives me, the loop length kind of acts like a loop end, but now when I change the start position, they both change, so I can scan through the sample. The way we've done that is we're just adding the loop length, or the loop end as it was, to the loop start. So they both get added together. Now I'm using this trigger object. You may notice, and if I do a little demo here, let's get some basic number boxes. Oh, just type a number. So let's get 2 integers, an adder and another integer. So you may have noticed that Max has hot and cold inlets. What does that mean? Well, if I put 1 in, you might think, hang on, why isn't it changing? 1 plus 0, it should be 1. The problem is the right inlets are usually cold, and you can actually see that they color it blue, whereas the leftmost inlet is always a hot inlet. And what that means is whenever that receives a message, it also triggers the object. So we don't get any output until it sends something here. So now we get 6 plus 1, or 1 plus 6 is 7. So now it's working. But when you change this, it doesn't, the number's still going into it, but it's holding the calculation until it receives something here. And then it will trigger it. Sometimes you want it to always trigger no matter which one is changing. So I'm using this trigger object, which is new object trigger, or T for short, and bang integer. You can read the trigger help and it explains it in more detail. So if I go into this trigger, what it's going to do when it receives a message, it's going to send out the integer, because it always goes from right to left. So the integer comes out first, that goes into there, and then a bang comes out. And when you roll over it, if you can't remember, it says in there. So then the bang comes out. So we want it to bang the left side, because that triggers it. And again, you can see that when you roll over, it triggers the calculation. So that's what these are for. You'll often see them in patches, and it's a way to actually trigger things when stuff changes. So now if I change this, it's always adjusting the calculation, no matter which one is changing. Great. So what if we want to make this look a little bit nicer? Let's start looking at presenting our patches. So what we do, we have a look through our patch and decide what user interface elements we want to have in our front panel, if we think of it. Max has a front panel view, and it's done in this little button here at the bottom, presentation mode. When you click it, everything disappears because I've got nothing there yet. click it again, it goes back to my patch. What user interface objects do I want? Well, I want these two. So if I right click with them highlighted and scroll down, you can see add to presentation. When you do that, you can see that it has this kind of red glow around it. Let's do it for the dials as well. And we probably want these guys here as well. Select them, maybe the fader, maybe that as well. We don't need to really see any of the other stuff. So right click, add to presentation. So let's now go back to presentation. All right, it's thinned out our patch a little bit. That's nice. How can we make it look a bit nicer? Perhaps we bring it all up to the top to make it, if we want to export it as a Max for Live device, maybe bring it up here. Perhaps then we have speed, loop start, and loop length. I can't quite read it, so I'm going to make it a bit bigger. There we go. And then these guys, line them up. Maybe the live gain. Let's make that a bit shorter so it lines up. Looks better. And perhaps then the finally, that'd be nice if it lined up as well, wouldn't it? There we go. And how could we, well, I guess this doesn't need to be, let's make that a bit longer. It'd be nice if there was a panel. If I go to the little plus, interface, there's all these interface objects. This one, panel, is just a background area. That's what it looks like. Little box. It doesn't do a huge amount. It's just a nice graphical thing. I'm going to give it a border size 1. Let's change the border color. Maybe it'll be that kind of interior color. Do we want gradient? Don't know if I want gradient. I think it's just going to be a color fill. That's quite nice. Mellow. If I drag it over here, it blocks out. Our stuff's underneath it, so what we have to do is select it, right click, and send it to the back. There we go. So we can line these up a little bit, maybe. And then perhaps have another one there. Copy and paste it, send it to the back. Both of these could perhaps be a bit taller, might make it cool. So we can see the sample a little better. Okay, that's not bad. Plenty more tidying up to be done, but it's a bit easier than looking at that. Of course, when we jump back, everything goes back to where it was. Let's move these panels because we added those and they've kind of been just placed in random areas. So you can just stick them out of the way on top of each other or something. Great. Okay. Let's save it and check it works. So lock it, drag in a sample, turn audio on. Getting some nice sounds out of that. Great. So hopefully that has given you some ideas to work with if you're using audio, sample looping. Creating a range is a really nice thing to be able to play around with sample loops. Being able to choose a loop length and having this always track the length of the sample. There's plenty more that I could develop this because of course when I drag this, these don't change at the moment, so I might find a great loop there and then I want to change the start, oh, and it resets sort of thing. So there's plenty of things that I could change about this, but it's not bad. It's perhaps if get some other thing. What have we got here? That's a pretty loud one. Turn the volume down. Random Game Boy sounds, but you get the idea. It could be a nice little thing that we brought into Ableton. I think I'll do the bringing into Ableton as a different tutorial, just so this one doesn't go too long. Great, so get back to me. As always, the tutorial slots are recurring every week, so you just go onto your calendar and rebook a new one for the next week. If you need one, and come back to me with questions and we can look at your patches. Okay, nice one. See you in a bit.